Coming up, The Athletic provides a tier ranking system for all NBA players. Should Kevin Durant's status either frustrate, infuriate, embolden the Brooklyn Nets fan base around what their expectations are for the Nets going forward? We break down those tiers, we break down those players, all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, after missing just one rep, I almost couldn't get into the intro of the show. As we said at the top, we got Seth Partnow, obviously, reporting on The Athletic, an article that he's done previous seasons of the tier system, where we get to remind ourselves that Kevin Durant is one of the greatest basketball players in the league today.
Nothing gets people madder than a good ranking system. I'll tell you that, because everyone, you want to get the fan base, you want to get a group of people just absolutely fired up, like just burning a hole through the keyboard to respond to something. Go make a list of something and see, and then decide where your player lands on that list, and it just drives people nuts. Now, Seth Partnow from The Athletic is awesome, one of the best guys to follow when it comes to just following NBA stuff. Does his tier system, does tiers for a reason, but then he does try to group, players into different groups and then does rank them within those groups. He released this last week, and we thought it would be a good chance to catch up on, a non-Nets related person who's looking at the NBA from like an analytical level and deciding the relative value of players right now. This has nothing to do with their contracts. This has nothing to do with anything else. It's just going into this season of basketball, what you want for your team. Obviously, that other stuff all matters. But this is just a tiered system for right now. Effectively, you have one game to win, or you have one season to win, or something like that, where where the players land. And I was very surprised. And you and I are going to kind of bat this back and forth. But Kevin Durant, I won't bury the lead here. Kevin Durant is in tier 1 among the group of superstars, and he's actually second overall in Seth Partnow's rankings. The list starts with his tier 1, which has 8 players in it. And just so you know, there's no predetermined, it doesn't like have to make it every 10 players. He groups the players by where he thinks that they lived sort of together in a tier. So tier 1 has 8 players in it. That list from 8 is LeBron James, 7 is Kawhi Leonard, 6 is Luka Doncic, 5 is, I'm having trouble counting backwards for some reason, 5 is Joel Embiid, 4 is Steph Curry, 3 is Nikola Jokic, 2 is Kevin Durant, and 1 is Giannis. And I will say within each tier, he does group them. So he has tier 1A, that's the Giannis, Durant, Jokic, Curry group, which sits above that. So he's placing Durant at the top of the mountain here still. What did you think when you saw that? I can give my thoughts too, but when you saw Durant pop this high on the list, effectively calling him the second best player in all of basketball going into this season, like, were you surprised by that?
Yeah, and then just to, as you said at the top there too, getting an outside perspective is, that confirms or denies what can feel like, bias in and around covering a team or rooting for a team. So if you're a Nets fan, you get to say, oh yeah, Kevin Durant's the greatest player in the world. Okay, maybe he's not, had he shown up even lower on this tier 1. To your point, I think that you can always put Kevin Durant, based on the way that we've talked about him, discussed about his game, and talked about how his game is going to age gracefully as he gets a little bit older here. I think one of the misnomers around Kevin Durant right now, maybe because he came off the injury, going back obviously a few seasons, is that somehow he is light years older than 33, going to be 34, as opposed to guy who missed a lot of time and is now fully healthy. Like, he's closer to years. And if that's a part of the perspective that you bring into it, along with just the state of his game, I totally get him being up there near the top of this list. Now, whether or not I can discuss other names here and some younger names that maybe could be deserving of that number 2 spot, we can debate that in a minute. But I don't I really, at first blush, I don't blink an eye at the fact that he's included in at a minimum that top tier, that 1 through 4 category that we're talking about.
Yeah, nothing will start the it's like buying a house. Nothing will start having people starting looking at the house and all the problems with it, like getting like a trade discussion will do it, right?
Right.
Because notice a lot of other players on this in this top tier aren't being nitpicked apart by like what their relative league value is right now because they're not getting moved and the conversation is not developed around what type of asset package needs to come back for a player that wants to be traded. None of the rest of this group, as it stands right now, wants to be traded. So that discussion, even around where, well, he's this age and he's had a lot of injuries. Like when we're ranking these things, like that will it will play a factor. It's like why Kawhi got a little dinged here. It's why LeBron gets a little dinged, in terms of, because the last couple of years have been a little rough on the injury thing. But I think you're totally right. Kevin Durant, in some people's minds, has definitely slid down here for no other reason except that he has to be traded, which again has nothing to do with his relative basketball value. Maybe it hurts his trade value a little bit because the leverage is gone. But in terms of his overall basketball value, we're less than a half of a season away from him just being like the odds-on favorite for MVP. Then he got hurt, right? Like he was in the MVP discussion early, not 2 years ago, this year. Yeah. This year, for the way he started the season. That has been completely forgotten because he knocked knees with Bruce Brown and had to sit out a bunch for the hyperextension, had to sit out a bunch of weeks. Had that not happened, Kevin Durant almost assuredly would have been in the top 4 of MVP discussion this season. Like, I don't like that without a doubt, if not have won it. Yes, injuries happen. You can't just wash it away. But man, has that gotten forgotten. Like among a group of people, this has been just completely wiped to the side. So like to just parrot what you're saying, when we see it put on display by someone who has no allegiances except to try to get the list right for a large crowd of people through using analytics. And in a little bit, I'll read you some of what he said about Durant. Like, it's a nice reminder. It's a nice wake-up call about what we're talking about. We're talking about Kevin freaking Durant here. Like this is why if you see me pulling my hair out around like Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, and you'll be lucky if you get a pick. Like this is why it's like, it makes you so crazy to think about it.
And as you say, we'll get into some of the framework of it, and then talk about some of the other players that are on this list, obviously. But to your point, whether or not we've had all these discussions, and I can say, well, if it's a Toronto package, if it's a Phoenix package, if it named any team you want, Miami, etc. I can sit here and have a conversation around what are the Nets getting back, and can they be a competitive team? Can they be a team that has a reasonably bright future? Can they get back draft capital? Okay, great. I can compartmentalize that and then also tell you, no, this isn't remotely near the value scale that Kevin Durant is. And anytime that people talk about Toronto being the example with Scotty Barnes, I get it, but you're still projecting, and this is true about anybody, by the way, all these young talents, when they have a good first couple of seasons. Donovan Mitchell is in the trade discussions now. Has he set a fantastic baseline for his career early on? Yes. Has he accomplished anything near the spectrum of Kevin Durant or the other top players, Giannis and other guys that are in this top 8 tier list? No, not even close. And that's why you cannot look at them comparatively and say, well, yeah, but he's younger, and what could he do? Yeah, what could he do? I can only point to all these other players and tell you what they have done. And that's what makes the difference between where you rank these players and why. And I do this, why even as players do get older, you cannot all of a sudden start to work this sliding scale with just youth. Youth is not enough. You have to still accomplish it. And these are all the best players in the game. And what separates them is winning MVPs, winning NBA championships, winning scoring titles, and doing it for 10, 15, 20 years in the case of LeBron James.
Totally. And it makes me wonder too about like where the comparisons would start falling. Like if Kawhi Leonard has to go on the block right now, you know what I mean? Like if the conversations would be the same around him, or if there's something of like a stink left over from the way the Nets season ended last year, which I would say was wholly not Durant's fault. Like it was, I think he would be so far down on the list of like where we would place the blame. And it's just simply not at Durant's feet. Right. Like, but for some reason he's lumped into the mess that it became, for sure.
To your point, what did this look like if Kevin Durant doesn't get the knee knock and go down? What are those extra games that he didn't play? And Brooklyn, where are they in the playoff picture? How does everything set up from there, whether it's success or not in the playoffs? How would you be looking at Kevin Durant would be dramatically different just by him being on the court for an extra, not even the whole time, extra 15 games. You'd be talking about and looking at him very differently and by the way, as this tier does dismiss those things and say, no, he's still deserving of being number 2.
I'll tell you, I mean, I'll tell you another reason why where this would totally shift to, and it has to do with the end of the season. Then I want to get into some of what Seth Partnow had to say about Durant, because I think that is instructive to like what we can think about his career. We're going to get into all that in a second. First, let me tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. Get the taste buds ready, folks. If you're trying to stay healthy this summer, it's tough. You're trying to get snacks on the go. Maybe you're trying to keep up with the kids. You're headed to the beach. You need a healthy snack that's going to fill you up, that you know is good for you. You can try the Built Bar, and then you can actually get into the coconut chunk Built Bar and the Built Bar Puffs too as well. All this stuff completely 100% covered with real chocolate, which makes you start thinking, oh, this can't be good for me. Nope, it is actually good for you. They figured out the protein bar, low calorie, low sugar, high protein, all delicious. The Puffs are go with you. If you got a craving, you know that you can satisfy the sweet tooth, and you know you're gonna be able to indulge without really indulging. That's what Built Bar and the Built Puffs give you. You go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off of your order. Use the promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com.
And of course, before we dive into some of the framework of this list for The Athletic and Seth Partnow, I just want to remind everybody, if you're wondering what's going to happen with the NFL, ooh, baby, July 18th, Locked On is going to give you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers at Bet Online. Available July 18th, coming up. Right now, it's happening. You could be absorbing it. You can go get it on your podcast feed. It's out there for you. The Locked On NFL is available wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. So talking about ranking systems, man, why not go see how the NFL ranks their guys? And you get really upset when your player is not high enough on that list. You talked about the ranking factors here as far as what goes into it and what Seth had to say about Kevin Durant. That, again, I will just acknowledge before you hit those, and maybe I'm going to say this a couple times throughout the episode, I get caught up in the micro as we talk about what are the Nets going to do? What are the possibilities? I'm willing to discuss all the speculation and still come back to neutral on it. But the more chaos, let's say, that the Nets have had around their organization, it is the harder, and any team could look at this, the harder it is to take that deep breath and say, now let's just remember what we do have, what we don't have, and the choices that we're making.
Yeah, and before I even get to some of his just like methodology here, I will say just walk yourself back to the playoffs last year and think about what the Kevin Durant's discussion would be. Not even about the series. Imagine Jason Tatum's game winner doesn't go in at the end of game 1, right? Like the buzzer beater. They were winning that game. They were winning with basically 0 seconds left, and then they're winning by 16 in the second game. Like there's a world, and it's not that hard to imagine, where they just win those first 2 games. And I'm just using it by they lost on a buzzer beater and they're winning by double digits in the second game. Right. And they lost both. If they're up 2-0 in that series, even if they lost that series, even if the Celtics came back and won, right? Like, even if there had been some fight around that series, I think even that we're talking about Durant differently, right? But it ends up with a sweep. It ends up going out the worst way possible. Obviously, he asked for the trade. It's this whole thing. But it all completely spirals. Again, all of that is like non-Kevin Durant basketball related. So I just want to like remember that I mostly got reminded of this the other day because I was watching that Tatum. It was before the Nets Summer League game. They showed a highlight of that series, and I was like, right, that was so close. Like the Nets were so close.
Let me ask you on that. Do you think that players suffer in the same way that fans do of that right there? Like, can Kevin Durant go back and say, "Oh, we were winning. Like we had game 1 locked, and then a buzzer beater. We're up 16." Some tweaks to the roster here, and we can be right back where we want to be. Do you think the players suffer that as well, where it's just like, we got swept? Like, I was disinterested. We lost in a first round series against Boston. Like, we're miles away, and they can almost lose the forest for the trees in terms of all the factors that go into a lack of success. Not that it needs to be Kevin Durant ultimately requests a trade because he can't see all these factors. It can be the accumulation of that forces him to ask for it. But I do wonder if they fall prey to that, right? Of just, hey, man, circumstances, and all of a sudden you can't realize how talented this roster could still be because you haven't gotten the sample size.
Yeah, I think it must be part of it. I do think there's probably an underselling of what these guys go through behind the scenes that informs a lot of this decision that they'll just never make public. And so I think that's as much a part of it. And that stuff's just almost never going to come out. And so I think that part actually gets undersold. I think probably what you're saying is like you left the season with a bad taste in your mouth, and that's probably very difficult to overcome. And I think there's like some myriad of factors that go on with these guys in their relationships, in their conversations, in whatever they see as the vision, whatever, right or wrong. They could be wrong about this too. I'm not saying like they see it all and we have to believe them. I think sometimes that could be a misassessment by them. But I do think there's like this undercurrent of stuff that we'll just simply never know about that probably is a bigger factor than what you just mentioned. But again, this is all speculation. Let me go through a little bit of what Partnow had to say about Durant and why he placed him above above the MVP Jokic, above Steph Curry, who just won the championship, against above Embiid, who finished second in it, above a guy like Luka, yada, yada, yada. What he has to say about Durant starts with kind of apologizing, or not even apologizing, but discussing around like how he was actually surprised with the pushback that he got for putting Durant this high on the list. I'll paraphrase some of what he said. He was like, I was surprised by the level of pushback I got for keeping Durant this high. He had him as basically this spot last year. Understandably, most of it was related to Brooklyn's sweep at the hands of the Celtics, so what we were just talking about, and Durant's poor performance in that series, which we did not just discuss, which I may have overlooked. That argument would be unassailable if this project only addressed the most recent season. However, Durant is less than a year removed from being the best player in the world, both into the 21 playoffs and the Olympics. While some of the Nets quagmire of season falls on Durant's shoulders, that's much more attributable. And then he goes on to saying that it's like organizational stuff, and saying how tumultuous the season was. That said, it would be inconsistent if I didn't at least mention that after returning from his 2019 Achilles, he has only managed to play in 87 of Brooklyn's 154 regular season games. So he stops there. Mostly this is built on where he had him the previous year, and saying what he's saying was mostly is, I had him here last year, which no one disagreed with. Okay. No one disagreed with that ranking following the 2021 year where he was a toe away from making it to the conference finals. But nothing about this season dissuaded him from keeping that ranking. Does that make sense? Like, by that description, does that make sense to you?
Yes, it makes sense. However, if you want to put in the context of the list, and he's done this year over year, going back to 2020, if you look at it through that lens, then you would say, but Joel Embiid, who was a 1B and remains a 1B, but he's coming off of a pretty gosh darn dominant season, right? Like I would understand flip-flopping Embiid and Durant based on previous year for Embiid, current year for Kevin Durant. You could make the argument, now you're splitting hairs around ultimate success. The Joker is as obviously as deserving as anybody of maybe being higher. Now, Seth Curry, I think, is doing a heck of a job for himself, because even though you do have Luka in there as well, you're primarily you're not talking about a lot of guards being on this list. Obviously, coming off the championship, he was still a 1A guy and a 1B player going back before that. Luka has come up over the last few seasons on this list. So I'm a little bit curious around that piece of it, because in a vacuum, I understand the logic. But if we were going to expand and just talk about this list as a whole, would I have been shocked or disgusted if you told me that Kevin Durant was 5th or 7th out of these top 8? No, I wouldn't. I would understand it. I'd say that he's capable of being higher, and it's totally okay for him to be a little bit lower. And that's what I think is maybe interesting to look at next is when you look at these group of players, would you right now in this moment put a handful of them maybe ahead of Kevin Durant, knowing that another season from now, whether in Brooklyn or somewhere else, Kevin Durant could be like, by the way, I'm the first guy on this list.
Yeah, and look, and as a reminder too, when we're talking about this group of players, we are splitting the finest of hairs, right? Yeah. It's like this is why it's sometimes funny to have this. It's like, hey, can we just agree that there's a group of players that sit kind of far above the rest of the crowd, right? And at that point, it maybe doesn't matter which way we mix and match them, because we just all pretty much agreed that this is the group. And and that's where the lists kind of cause a bunch of animosity, because it is the your guy over my guy mentality that people like don't want to see, and it makes them mad. I think we were discussing this to begin, and I think you're right about if we ranked them 5th, would it change our feelings too much about this? I don't think so. That would have probably felt just as good too, just because I can't imagine me wringing my hands around that wrap up. I want to talk more about this. We got to take a quick break.
All right. So then diving back into it here, when we talk about obviously this list overall, and looking at the tiers, I think, what would be interesting too, because you said, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, a bunch of really good players. Like, we need not know who is 5th or 7th or 8th or 1st for us personally to know how good they are. But if we extend then this to, you want to say, into that, what I think would be fascinating is a guy like Jason Tatum, who sits just outside this top tier, right? Nobody else, when I scan through it at a pass, would I say, oh, interesting conversations around Jimmy Butler, and how the opinion of him has certainly changed very quickly in his time going to Miami. Fascinating to think about, is there someone here that should have been pushed up, especially if you look at Kawhi Leonard and say, yeah, the last time we saw him, what was he doing versus what have we not seen him do in the last couple of seasons? Play basketball. Are there any ones like that you do look at and say, in our group of our guys that we think are up there in the top of the list, are there players that should be further up there that have already proven it or are close enough to having had proved it in recent enough seasons?
And just as context, the 2A is Tatum and Butler.
Yeah.
2B is Anthony Davis, John Morant, James Harden, Trae Young. And 2C is Chris Paul, Dame, Devin Booker, Paul George, and Rudy Gobert. And the case for Gobert is interesting that he makes. I can see people pushing back on that one. Regardless, that's the two. No, I think that's a great point by you, because you wouldn't move any. I don't think you would right at this moment move any of those guys into that next group. Tatum clearly is the closest, not just because he's on at 2A, but he's the one that you could see being on that top tier. Maybe if the Celtics win the championship, he just is in that group. Like sometimes that can inform just the littlest bit. I get the feeling that had Tatum walked away with finals MVP, he would be in that group. And sometimes you need to kind of be a finals MVP. But a lot of that list, especially the guys that have been around in the league, have been finals MVPs, right? Yeah. Kawhi, LeBron, KD has been a finals MVP, and Steph are all, anyone that's like among the requisite age owns that. And sometimes like guys like Luka and Joker and those guys haven't been around long enough yet, right? But so he probably would have moved up. No, I wouldn't move anyone up. And again, that is a good way to look at this, because you're like, yes, this is so clearly the top group. This is so clearly the top group of 8 guys that it'd be hard to make a very solid case about why anyone should move up to the next group. So if you're talking about this group, we have to talk about this realistically when we're talking about Durant. And I guess maybe the only thing we're really talking about is like the leverage that they lost by him requesting the trade, because maybe that's not maybe this hasn't been the discussion, but it sure seems like it's becoming the discussion about what his skills and his age regression are going to be.
Yeah, well, listen, we talked about it so much more with Kyrie Irving when it comes to his personality and the impact on the franchise, and switching from teams from Cleveland to Boston and ultimately to Brooklyn, and how that has damaged his value or his market. But everyone seems to want to say, but when on the court, Kyrie Irving is one of the best players in the game. And to your point, it seems
Seth
like
Partnow said that.
Yeah, touche. As we'll maybe come back into this a little bit later, later in the week, and discuss where he had Kyrie Irving on this list. But Kevin Durant now seems to be getting a little bit of that treatment around, from outsiders, not on this list, but outsiders would say, oh yeah, now that you're running into a trade request, and now that maybe things didn't work here in Brooklyn, and you go back and we all know, leaves OKC, joins Golden State, then chooses to leave one of the best, most stable franchises in recent memory. So there's all these little things that are there, and you're always saying, he's one of the best players in the game. Now it feels like, okay, there's enough breadcrumbs here that I want to follow this trail and maybe suggest that the end of Kevin Durant's dominance, or that he cannot be the number one or the leader of your team now. And that can change your perception. That seems to be what people are willing to discuss. I tend to, I dismiss it pretty heavily. And by the way, you can even talk about this when you look at this list. I thought it interesting too. From that top 8 category, the guys closer to the bottom, like LeBron, like Kawhi, they have been they are falling. Potentially, they went from 1As to 1Cs. Even when you get to Luka, now he's a rising talent. That makes more sense because he's about to be entering into the prime of his career. Likewise for Joel Embiid. Like, all those players are going the right direction based on age and a lot of the other factors. Kevin Durant is basically treading water. Like, that's what's happening. And Giannis has just been a 1A guy, in perpetuity. But I think that that's the difference here too. In this moment, you want to start shuffling this deck. I want John Morant to be higher. I'm taking the name at random, right? I want him to be so much higher. Or Jimmy Butler is not nearly the same talent of player that a lot of these guys are to be right there at the top of the second tier behind Jason Tatum. Yes, but over these last handful of seasons, he's shown himself to be that valuable. We could be 2 years away from Jimmy taking a big tumble down. We could be a year away from Luka being right at the top of this list behind Giannis potentially. But you have to be willing to contextualize it accurately. And that's what ends up being, I'll say, interesting about lists like this, is that you're weighting different factors, right? And some are going to say your reliability, that is paramount in being available. And that's why Kyrie or players that get just injuries that take players off the court, that's going to be a big ding on them. Where other ones say, no, just the talent, pure talent. And if we're talking pure talent, that's why Kevin Durant deserves to be there.
Yeah, and that's always going to be difficult. And Durant has had bad injuries. He's off of an Achilles injury. 3 years removed from an Achilles injury, which is a really, really bad one. And so I get it. Most guys have injuries on their resumes at this point if you've had enough time in the league, and it happens. And this is why you have age regression around this stuff. And sometimes it can be overblown. Like sometimes for a single season, it can be overblown if you're just looking to enter a season with trying to put yourself in the best chance to win the championship. Because I think that this still would be the list would be shuffled around, but this would still be the list, even if you factored in all the injuries for every player. And they every team started a new draft this season and said, hey, for 1 year, we need maybe even 2 years, frankly, 2 years we have to win the championship. Where are you going to be picking players? Like if you just set that as the parameter and let every NBA team do that, what's the lowest Durant goes? He does not go below any people on this list.
No.
Okay. He doesn't. Like maybe he's the 8th guy instead of the 2nd guy, but he does not go lower than anyone on this list. And frankly, I would say almost every time he doesn't even go 8th. Like he goes somewhere higher because smart people that get this understand this still to be the case. Like the narratives matter very little. And just think about it through that lens. Like if you had 2 seasons, who are you picking? Are you picking Jimmy Butler over? There's no way. There's no chance. No chance.
Right.
Like, and so I think just looking through that lens helps to lend clarity to the situation.
And by the way, even you mentioned Jimmy Butler or Jason Tatum, but use some of the other. You can say Anthony Davis, right? All factors being equal. If you said, and then go like to younger guys, which we've talked about before about backcourts, etc. But a Trae Young, a Morant, you're not taking the young, sexy 2-year window of any of these guys over Kevin Durant. And I think. We've been talking so much about trade value, and you mentioned you were discussing the Phoenix Suns on the last episode. I think this is then the other part of where parsing out when you see lists and you see value of players, the separation between what someone pays for someone, whether in players or assets or capital, etc. You cannot do this. You can't do a conversion chart. There is no what was Rudy Gobert worth and what will Donovan Mitchell be worth and what could. It doesn't matter because it's all predicated on what teams are desperate enough, what teams are looking at the next 2 years versus the next 10 years, what teams have the capital, where players want to go. In that same regard, there's so many factors. It all comes down to a little bit, I think, of personal perspective and where you weight different values of things. I would like to think that at some point we come to this universal consensus that, well, actually, you know what? Let me add on this. Would you say LeBron James, wouldn't everybody, like he's had some injury concerns in his last couple of years. He's even a few years older than Kevin Durant. But if you could have a 2-year window with LeBron James, would anyone dispute that right now? Like no one would dispute taking Kevin Durant, LeBron James for a 2-year window, yet somehow you're going to take this arbitrary pause on Kevin Durant. That is maybe the one-to-one that would make me go, that's why it doesn't make sense to push him in any other category.
This is why I was saying like this is the group. This is the group of 8 guys. Like this is why Kawhi Leonard can sit out a year and still in this group, because if you were starting, you had to win, your life was on the line, and you had a draft to win the championship. Yeah. These would be the first 8 guys taken in the draft without a doubt. And if you didn't, you run the risk of losing your life earlier than some of the other people. that's just it. Like you made a mistake. Number 9, whoever's drafting 9 in this draft is dying for you to make a mistake. Dying for someone above them to make a mistake and take a guy like Butler, take a guy like Trae, someone like that. Like that would be the best thing ever, because like the worst pick, like it wouldn't be bad, but like if you're pick 9, all you want is for someone to make, it's like a fantasy draft. Like you're just dying for someone to make that mistake and draft it out of order. Like maybe they know something you don't, but in the long run, like that will have been a mistake to not have this group be among the top 8 guys if it was all on the line. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more tomorrow about Kyrie, and like I don't think he's on the list. Like I don't just going to bury the lead here a little bit. And we look at the list wasn't laid out in the top 125. So if I'm wrong about this, but this is going to be the setup for tomorrow, because I don't think he's on the list. And I am just going to probably reach out to Seth here and see if he responds to me, because I want to make sure that I want to make sure that it's right. And if it's not, let me know ahead of time so we don't do a silly episode about this. But I don't think he was on there. And if that was the case, it'd be an absolutely egregious error. That you can help the podcast. Like and subscribe on YouTube, like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
And as we know, my friends, you got to be the best of the best. Remember, boys, no points for second place. Slider from Top Gun.
Well, RIP, I'm not sure about that. RIP wasn't in the spoiler. It was not in the sequel, but they never mentioned him. So I'm gonna say still living. but definitely still one of the all-time great poets.
Honorable mention. Sorry, bad ending to the show here. Honorable mention for being in Roxanne was Steve Martin. I don't know if.
Oh yeah, he was the guy. He was the firefighter that didn't know any.
I'll write her a letter. I'll write her a letter.
Yeah,
I'm good at that stuff.
Oh, I used to know one of the lines for that. This is a terrible way to end the podcast. All right, we'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.